New Thinking Aloud is presented by the California Institute for Human Science, a fully accredited university offering distant learning graduate degrees that focus on mind, body, and spirit. The topics that we cover here. We are particularly excited to announce new degrees emphasizing parapsychology and the paranormal. Visit their website at cihs.edu.
Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we'll be exploring money and the meaning of life. With me in the studio is Professor Jacob Needleman, a philosopher at San Francisco State University and author of numerous books, including The Way of the Physician, Lost Christianity, The Heart of Philosophy, and Money and the Meaning of Life. Welcome, Jacob.
I'm glad to be here, Jeffrey.
It's good to be with you. You know, money is so all-pervasive in our culture. It's as if we lose ourselves because of it. There's something about money that seems to pull us away from our own instinct to become self-aware. We tend to go blind around it.
Yes, but we go blind around many things, and the particular blindness with money is that we don't really include it as part of what we need to see and understand and relate to in ourselves. We tend to separate it off as though there was something, as though we're not related to our self-knowledge, our search for self-knowledge. It's something we feel, well, I'll take care of making money or whatever, and then I'll do something spiritual or something about self-transcendence or self-understanding. But my point is that we have to include that aspect of ourselves as a very vital thing to include in our search for self-awareness.
You mention in your book that the well-known biblical phrase, render unto Caesar that which is Caesar and is Caesar's, and render unto God that which is God is God's, is one of the most difficult phrases to understand in the Bible. Why is that so?
Well, it's not so hard to understand it intellectually, but to actually live it, to be able to realize that there really are two sides to human nature, that the human being is a unique being in all of creation, and that there is a spiritual element, a transcendent side to ourselves, and a social animal side to ourselves, and that our unique destiny is to try to bring a relationship between two very different forces in ourselves. And God and Caesar could be understood as representing those two forces, the social, survival, animal, normal, everyday side of ourselves, dealing with managing our life and doing well and succeeding in physical, social, psychological needs, and the God side, the divine side, was something which goes much far beyond that, something very, very different. So that to live that saying means you have to really be able to distinguish these two sides of ourselves, and that's not easy to do in actual practice. That's what I'm saying.
I know, well, for example, Sri Aurobindo, the Hindu yogi, once said that money itself is divine. Might anything material have a divine quality to it? Do you think that some of our confusion lies with ideas like that?
Yes, I think, I don't know, I think the origin of money is very interesting. I think one way of looking at the origin of money, and there's some evidence to show for that, whatever evidence is worth, is that it originated as a very great invention, maybe even by spiritually developed people, to help human beings relate to each other in a way that reminded them of they have a higher destiny and yet at the same time there's something called individual rights and individual property and individuality, but at the same time I need you. We have an interdependence that's very strong. So in that sense, maybe you could say money, there's something sacred about the origin of money. But of course, what's become of money is anything but sacred. And nowadays, and for hundreds of years, money has been something that's been associated with all that's most divisive in human life, with cunning, with deceit, with anxiety and fear and self-deception and sentimentality and wishful thinking and all sorts of things. So I don't know if I'd be prepared to say that money is divine or sacred, but the question of how to be toward money has I think, a sacred element to it.
It's interesting that you mentioned that the focus on money goes back a couple of centuries, and in our culture, that it implies that our culture may be different in this regard than earlier cultures.
I think it is. Of course, I'm not an economist or a historian, but I think something took place with the capitalist, what Max Weber called the spirit of capitalism and the Industrial Revolution. And when Columbus came back and when all the gold and silver of the New World started entering into Europe and things got charged in a completely new way, the whole money device took on another meaning. When the spiritual, or the religious rather, relationship to money in the Middle Ages began to be undermined a bit, the usury laws began to be undermined, Calvinism, as Max Weber's interpretation, became more influential in the sense of a worldly spirituality began to come in, and banks became, we had this great invention called the bank, more or less, invented in the past few hundred years, where this enormous discovery is that you don't have to have as much in your bank as you issue notes for, which began to be the whole question of what is money really? Right. What is this? And I've asked really very interesting people, some advisors to presidents, very wealthy people. A man who was the budget advisor to one of our presidents, I met him one evening and I said to him over a cocktail, "What is money?" And he said, "I don't know. I don't know." Nobody really knows what this thing is. It's both the most insubstantial thing in the world, a piece of paper, a piece of plastic, a credit, and yet at the same time, it's the image of what's real in most people's minds. Bottom line, real world. Now we're getting down. So money is it's an extraordinary force, and we don't understand it. We have to face that we don't understand it.
One of the points you seem to be making is that money is a force that reaches so deep into our nature that we can't hope to understand it intellectually, that we have to get a handle on our relationship to money in a much deeper way than just our ideas about it.
Absolutely. And it enters, the whole relation to money enters into most of us when we're very young in the household that we live in. For many people, they grow up when they're 2 or 3 years old. Their childhood is spent, and the most powerful force in the household is some anxiety or fear or something going on with money. So that gets right down in the guts. You can't just understand something like that by theorizing, and you have to be able to get down to the place where money grabs you, and that's not just an intellectual exercise.
So this really, I think, is what you mean when you suggest that we can't understand ourselves till we come to terms with the issue of money.
That's right.
We can't separate off the search for self-knowledge from the way in which we relate to money.
That's right. And that's, if there's anything pioneering in what my book is about, is that to try to bring this thing into the spiritual search rather than separate it off as being dirty or merely crass or worldly or something of that kind. You have to if you're going to know yourself, you have to know those parts of yourself that are engaged with the money thing. Just as sex was for a previous generation, money is, in a way, not as organically perhaps as sex, but in a way it's as much a hidden force in human life that nobody can face honestly as sex was for our grandparents.
It's a taboo.
It's a taboo, and even more complicated in a way than sexuality is because at least we have some vague idea of what it means to be normal about sex. even if nobody is. But with money, it's very hard. If you ask yourself, do you know anybody who's normal about money? Or do you even know what it means to be normal with money? I don't think anybody honestly can say yes to that. Everybody is a little weird about money.
Now, you referred earlier to Max Weber, whose classic book about the rise of capitalism and the Protestant ethic has really influenced sociology in a major way today. And he seemed to be suggesting that the Protestant viewpoint challenged the earlier Catholic idea of spirituality locked up away in a monastery. Yes. And it was if we lived our life, if we handled our affairs in the world, that there was a spiritual path in that. And yet I hear you challenging that point of view, saying that it doesn't help us enough because we've gone crazy about money in spite of that very noble ideal.
It's a complicated question there, and Max Weber's views are very subtle and complex in many ways, and the criticisms against them are. But painting with a very broad brush, he tried to argue that what capitalism has become in our culture is due largely to a form of Calvinistic emphasis on the world, one's vocation, one's calling, one's activity in worldly life as being a religious calling, and trying not to separate, as Protestantism tries not to separate so much the religious dimension of life from the worldly dimension of life. It's the great revolution, in a way, of Protestantism was to treat the world as my monastery, and not to seclude people off into something apart from life. And in that sense, it's a little like Judaism, in one sense, that and many other religions, which don't believe so much in removing people from the conditions of life. This is a great oversimplification. But Weber tried to show that it was through that religious aspect of worldly endeavor that capitalism became the unique kind of force it is in our culture. Capitalism has existed in many other societies, but in our culture it's become driven by a kind of religious fervor. Yes. And that's what he called the spirit of capitalism, not just the fact of capitalism. Now, my criticism is very presumptuous, but I'm saying it's not so easy to go into the world as maybe some I think Weber wasn't pushing that, but what I think he didn't see was that there is a way of going in the world and also being inwardly, as it were, monastic. Yes. To be fully engaged in life, and at the same time not swallowed by life. That, to me, is the real ideal of what Protestantism or Judaism or many of the great, what you might call the hidden aspects of the traditions speak about. And if that's true, if our aim is to be engaged in the forces of life without being fooled by them, swallowed up by them, destroyed by them, but on the contrary, to find ourselves in the midst of those forces, then in the present time of our culture, we have to understand money, because that's one of the, if not the main, if one of the main things that generates our situations in our life. So to be in the world but not of the world, I have to take money seriously and really see what it does and doesn't do.
But I hear you going a step further too. I hear you saying that we can't understand money until we, as a culture, develop better tools for understanding ourselves.
That's true, I think. I think we need better tools for understanding ourselves, but even to bring the money question into focus like that is, I think, a great step, if we could do that. It's just not been done. You just cannot find people writing about money or thinking about money from this perspective. And it was a very hard thing for me to think through, but it hasn't been brought into the search. There's plenty of things on how to make money, and there's plenty of fantasies about, do what you love and you'll get money will follow and things. That's been misunderstood, I think, a lot. But to actually take money really as seriously as anybody, a business person or anyone could, and at the same time not be swallowed by it, and to see what is the role of money in the search for consciousness. That has not been done by anybody in print that I know of, except one or two very great exceptions.
Well, what I hear you saying, one of the things is that in order to be fully engaged with the idea of money and not swallowed up by it, we have to understand what you call our dual nature.
Yes. Well, this two-ness that we spoke about at the beginning, this Kierkegaard said, for example, in one of his famous lines is, he says, what is the self? And the self is a synthesis. I won't go into the whole complex thing, but a synthesis of spirit and matter, time and eternity, infinity and finitude. Many of the greatest spiritual, philosophical, esoteric teachers have spoken of the two-ness of human nature and the remarkable force that's needed, that comes from a very high level in the universe, to make a relationship between these two opposing forces. This is the peace that passes understanding in the Christian doctrine. And when Jesus speaks of the peace that passes understanding, he's speaking of a relationship between two aspects of ourselves that are at war with each other, and they need to be harmonized. And money represents, in our culture, is to my mind, the aspect through which that one force of moving out toward outer life that's what money is, the conductor of that force in our individual and cultural life.
Let me ask you to rephrase it. Is the conductor of
the outer force, the force outward into functioning and social, biological survival, achievement, relationship. And I don't think there's money in heaven, but I don't think we can get to heaven without looking at money. If you see what I mean.
Yeah. Well, now let's talk for a second about heaven, because I know there's a wonderful passage, I found it wonderful in your book, where someone asks you, what is it that money can't buy? Can it buy love? Can it buy friendship? And you point out, well, it can buy love, it can buy friendship, but there's a certain kind of love, a certain kind of friendship that it can't buy. I think that's getting a little closer to the fundamental issue that you raise of self-awareness.
Yes. What I say in the book, in a kind of one of these almost too pat sayings, is that in our society, money can buy everything except meaning. Now, to open that up would mean there's a certain kind of love, there's a certain kind of friendship, there's a certain kind of creativity, there are many things that money can't buy that have to do with something very fine in human nature. But in order to know what money can't buy, we have to really understand more what money can buy. Because there's a lot of hypocrisy about thinking, well, money can't buy X, so I'm not going to deal with the money question, which covers over sometimes a fear or an incapacity to relate to life. And that X that you say money can't buy, money in fact could buy that. So it's a very interesting question. One of the challenges I sometimes put to my classes is to imagine some problem in their life that they're having. And I say to them, I'll bet 3 out of 4 cases your problem could be at least temporarily solved with a very definite amount of money. They say, oh no, it's a matter of morality. And then I say, well, look at it. And they're shocked to realize how much money really can do. So in order to know what it can't do, you can't be sentimental about what you think it can't do.
It's as if what you're saying is if we look more carefully at the things that money can do, it pushes us into a deeper understanding of that spiritual realm.
That's very well put. I think that's what it would be. Because when you really see all the things money can buy, then you realize there is something left out. But what is it? But if you're not aware of what money can do, then you tend to put into the spiritual side what is really not necessarily spiritual, but maybe psychosocial, which is fine. But it's not the same thing as the transcendent side.
In ancient cultures, and even today, money often has a spiritual symbol and a material symbol on it. Our money says, in God we trust. It's as if, going way, way back, there's a sense that the purpose of money is to remind us of something.
The two, yes, I think many coinages have that in, not all, but many units of money and coinage had that on it, the two sides representing, if you like, the two sides of human life. Money meant different things in other cultures, but in the American Indian, it's a bit different what happened to that. But I think it's a very good image, at least as a metaphor for the way to look at money now is to say, on the one side is a sacred symbol, on the other side is a secular or profane symbol. And neither one or the other alone is enough. They both have to, as long as we're on earth in this body, in this society, we're going to have to find a way of dealing with both sides of ourselves. And it's not easy. It's not easy. It's a difficult question.
You've, in your exploration, encountered people all across the economic spectrum. I gather that sometimes you find people without money have certain unique insights that the people with money don't have, and vice versa.
Oh, yes. I mean, you could say, what's the best way to understand money is to be poor. And then you really know something about money when you don't have it and you need it. So I wouldn't, it's interesting to talk to very wealthy people, but to talk to poor people is, if anything, more revealing. Or everybody has a money story. You talk to anybody and you have a whole story of it. You ask anybody about money and you find extraordinary things. But one of the interesting things I discovered, which is, I think others have noted that, is that if a person goes to a CPA or a tax preparer, I was noticing years ago, when I was revealing my financial life to my tax preparer, I was showing more about myself to him than I was to a therapist. And I began to realize that the tax or the financial consultants, if they see more about human life in a way, if they want to, almost than a therapist sees sometimes. And I'm beginning to think that we need a kind of accountant therapist new profession in our culture. And I think that it's actually beginning to happen. Mm-hmm. It's one of the other exercises, and some people try this, but in general, but is they'll have people, a very difficult, painful, and revealing exercise for many of us, to just try to write down every penny you spend and what you spend it on for a week or a month. It's sometimes very shocking, and it's shockingly difficult. Yeah. So when you see how you actually behave. And so in that sense, I think money is a key to self-knowledge, in that it tests our sincerity about ourselves. Mm-hmm. How to be really sincere about what my money life is like is very difficult. To sincerely see how I am, how I fear, what my anxieties are. Another exercise we did was to try to go out on the street and give somebody $1. Not a person selling anything or a beggar, but just give them $1. It's amazingly difficult. And it's difficult not only to try it, the people who you give it to have difficulty accepting it. Anyhow, it's a very interesting area for self-knowledge.
Yeah. Well, traditionally, I think money has been associated with ethics. And I have to say for myself, when I look deeply, I feel really disturbed about this. I felt nervous about doing this interview because I think under it all, I'm so disturbed about money. And one of the issues for me is that there's such overwhelming human needs, such poverty, homelessness, starvation. It seems one of the fundamental issues is, how can I justify doing anything for myself while other people are really suffering? Has that been part of your exploration?
Well, this is a kind of question that stops you in your tracks, no matter what you're doing. Mm-hmm. To feel the suffering and the injustice of the human condition. And at the same time, one is feeding oneself and taking care of oneself. And to know that even if you stop doing that, it wouldn't make much difference. And yet, you see all the self-justifications that go on and the incapacity to deal with these great questions. Of course, it has to enter, and it may be more poignantly with money. Mm-hmm. The point is not to turn away from those unsolvable, poignant questions, but to suffer them more consciously. Mm-hmm. By suffering them more consciously, we may get a glimmer of conscience of what really is possible. Not to turn away from them or try to fix them up too quickly, if you see what I mean. I had this extraordinary moment when I was down in Union Square in downtown San Francisco, and there was this person with no arms or no legs begging, a very interesting, beautiful young man. And I passed him by, like, with the nervousness that many of us have. And 100 yards down the block was a Petmobile. And there was a woman writing a check for $1,000 to find lost cats. Now, I love cats, too. But I was so shocked. There is a man 100 yards away begging for quarters. And here's a woman writing a $1,000 check for cats, saying, I'm sorry, it couldn't be more. This kind of contradiction in human life one has to face.
Yeah.
Just face it and not turn away from it.
Mm-hmm. Because it seems to me that one of the great tragedies of our culture is that we have so many, going back to Benjamin Franklin, platitudes. We deal with money in terms of little sayings and jingos and things so that we can soothe our conscience and not feel the real pain of our
Yes.
situation.
Very true. There's a lot of that's one of the dreaming element of money. There are many dreams connected with money. I don't mean dreams at night. I mean fantasies and, as you say, little jingles, little assumptions, platitudes that we never question. And we really don't understand how money operates. A really interesting business person sometimes really understands something about money as a force and an energy and the psychological side of it. Most of the rest of us are hopelessly frightened of this thing that seems to be like an immovable force, money. Mm-hmm. And it isn't. When you talk to really creative people in the financial world, they're moving with it in a very, very interesting way. Sometimes too interesting because they get into jail with it. But it has this thing of being the most real, and yet it's not like granite. It doesn't. You can push. You can work with it. So it's part of what I would call also the neglected art of worldly wisdom. Mm-hmm. We can be spiritual and search for the truth and divine in ourselves. That doesn't mean we have to be hopeless idiots in life.
Mm-hmm. And what you're suggesting is that we don't realize how hopeless we are around money.
We really are. Most of us are hopelessly, they're completely foolish about it.
I find this kind of encouraging because I thought maybe I was the only one.
Most people think they're the only one. That's part of the problem.
Well, Jacob Needleman, what a pleasure
it's always good
to have this discussion with you. It's really reassuring to think that we can finally begin to look at what may be our last taboo.
Yeah, I think so.
Thanks so much for being with me.
Very good.
And thank you for being with us.
Book 3 in the new Thinking Aloud dialogue series is UFOs and UAP, Are We Really Alone? Now available on Amazon.
You can now download a free PDF copy of issue number 8 of the new Thinking Aloud magazine or order a beautiful printed copy. Go to newthinkingaloud.org.